Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the writer and musician, Mark Brend, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love and poetry. And also, he's got a new book out titled Down River in Search of David Ackles, which has just come out August 2025 on Jawbone Publishing, which is a fantastic publication. And also, Mark was in various bands during the 80s and 90s, including the Palace of Light and various other musical combos, which we do also talk about in this interview, which you'll find out more about. Anyway, after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to the exciting subject of the early formative years. Mark, it is over to you.
That's an interesting thing. I mean, I can remember in the mid-70s, like starting to be aware of the music you're just talking about. And also my sister, who's a couple of years older, liking Motown.
Right.
Having a few records, but like having a Jimmy Ruffin greatest hits and a Diana Ross greatest hits. But I think really I started to engage with music with punk. And I was very interested in the first generation punk bands and then the subsequent post-punk stuff. And from that, I very quickly went into 60s garage rock, because in the late 70s, there was a label called Radar that reissued bands like the 13th Floor Elevators and the Electric Prunes and what have you. And I loved them.
Yes, the Sonics.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so that was where I came from musically. But by the time I got into the 80s, I liked Dylan and I liked Leonard Cohen, and I started to explore other singer-songwriters in the 60s, and that's eventually how I arrived at David Ackles, which is how I came to write the book.
Yes, and then so what year did you, I mean, when you got to 16, did you leave school at that stage, and what year was that roughly?
No, well, I'm 63. I was born in 1962. So I left school in 1980 and went to university a year later.
Right.
1981, and formed a band there. And so that was very much the kind of New Order, Echo and the Bunnymen era. I was listening to a lot of that sort of music at the time, went to loads of gigs when I lived in Manchester. And that's when I became sort of quite serious about playing music. And in fact, the two guys I formed a band with there, we worked together for years after.
Yes. So the Manchester period, did you live in Hume by any chance?
No, I didn't, but I knew people who did live in Hume. And in fact, there was a band we used to play with quite a lot who were called the Floating Adults initially, but before that, the Performing Ferret Band. And then eventually some of them went into Meow, who were on Factory.
Oh, yes, with Kath Carroll.
That's it, yeah. And they all lived in the Crescent Flats in Hume that are now long gone, I would imagine. They
yes.
Were, pretty in a dire state even then, you know.
Well, I know there was people like Big Flame were there, and a guy called Edward who was who did that song "It's a Fine Day," you know, and all that kind of malarkey with a woman called Jane. Yes, it was one of those indie classics. Because Cherry Red Records brought out that one "Pillows and Prayers" double album, didn't they? Which seemed to be on everybody. It was like in the 70s, everyone had Frampton Comes Live and War of the Worlds, bizarrely, but then, you know, indie people got, you know, Pillows and Prayers, and then it was the sort of, you took, you know, different routes in life. It was like a Jim Jarmusch movie, wasn't it, really, the paths that we took? You either became a new romantic or an angsty indie kid. So you were an angsty indie kid in the 80s. So that was kind of so you were in Manchester for quite a few years in those early formative period of the...
81 until 84.
Right. So you would have experienced the beginning of the Smiths.
Yes, I saw the Smiths very early on, just before This Charming Man was a hit.
Right.
So, and saw the Stone Roses very early on, but funnily enough, not in Manchester, in London. They did a very early gig at the Marquee, I believe. And saw when I first got there, saw a really early New Order gig as well.
Right. That must have been appalling, I think.
They played from memory. They played for about 30 minutes, and Peter Hook, I think, had his back to the audience for the entire gig, apart from when he sang one song that he had lead vocal on.
Right. I remember they played Norwich, and I think most people left because they just thought this is embarrassing. So, but that was a very early gig as well. So, but then sort of 85, you move to London. Is this en masse with your other bandmates, Matt and Jeff?
But Matt and Jeff were a year above me at university. They'd already left, and we moved. We agreed to reform the band, and actually, we initially convened at Hemel Hempstead, where Matt lived, and we stayed there for a few months. Then moved to London, but we didn't have a drummer, and so we spent a lot of time writing songs and trying to find a drummer, and eventually got a guy called Charlie Llewellyn, who was a couple of years older than us, but was like a proper musician. He'd been in bands that had made records and had been on John Peel and all of this type of stuff. So we were he was a great drummer as well. And we were really happy about that.
Oh wow, he was in various Glaxo Babies and Maximum Joy.
Maximum Joy, yeah.
Wow, go Charlie. Yeah, so at that stage, 85, I mean, this is, because I always put that classic 80s indie pop between 83 to 87, which is, as you can imagine, the years of the Smiths. So this was kind of the heartland of indie pop, really, that you sort of embraced.
I suppose it was, but I must admit, what we liked at the time, apart from the 60s singer-songwriters, we really liked the Australian bands who were active at the time.
Oh, the Triffids, Go-Betweens.
Yeah, Triffids, Go-Betweens, the Saints, Ed Cooper, all of those people we really liked. And we saw them perhaps more as influences, but although we also did very much like Ocean Rain, like that, but we weren't so much engaged with British indie music of the time, I would say.
Yes, but then you get this album together, beginning here and traveling outward. This is kind of quite a sophisticated pop record that you made here, isn't it? From with sort of a little bit of viola and quite lush production actually, and cello. I mean, I know there was a band called Shelley Ann Orphan at that point who was quite interesting and obviously got completely slated in the music papers by men. So yes, you sort of developed quite an expansive sonic soundscape here.
Yeah, we that album we were very keen to have a string quartet on it, and
which is unusual in the mid-80s, isn't it? The 90s, we all got into that world, didn't they? The My Life Story orchestra.
Yeah. I think it probably was quite unusual, but at the time we didn't really think of it because we were so caught up in our own world. But how it came about is that I worked in the record and tape exchange in Notting Hill, and there was a guy there who shared a flat with Grant McLennan from the Go-Betweens. And we were halfway through making the album, and we said we were looking for some string players. And this guy said, "Oh, I'll ask Grant to get the name of the people who played on whatever." I think that would have been Liberty Bell.
Right.
They had string players on, and anyway, the string quartet that we got was led by a woman called Audrey Riley, who was the go-to string arranger in indie circles in those days, and she led the string players in the communards. That was her day job, but she also played with the Go-Betweens and loads of people. If you look at a lot of 80s records with strings, Audrey is the person behind it.
Audrey, my God, that's fantastic, actually. Wow, that's great. So you got your label. Did you play much live? Were you quite a live band?
We didn't play much. We played in London. We never toured. And we did after the album was released. We played live with a string trio, not Audrey, but some other people, so that was quite a complicated undertaking, and it kind of half worked, but the equipment didn't quite cope with what we were trying to do, and there would be like 7 or 8 of us crammed onto a little stage in one of the small London venues. But we were never a big live band.
No, was it things like the George Roby you were playing and those kind of venues in London?
Yeah, it was, and there was one. God, the names escape me now. There was one in Kentish Town, wasn't there? Yes, I think we did play the George Roby, and that was in Finsbury Park,
Yeah.
and we didn't play the Falcon in Camden, which is where a lot of bands played at the time. They wouldn't have.
Yeah, it's a great sound. I was watching that video, The Way Home, which is quite nice, and it was all very optimistic. And the reason I think there were so many indie bands during that time was the unemployment benefit system acted as some sort of financial grant for bands, didn't they? Because you had the Job Seekers Allowance, Enterprise Allowance schemes. People could just sign on, get your housing benefit, council tax paid, and off you went. Here's £45.
Yeah, that's true. And when we first moved to London for the best part of a year, we did sign on, and that enabled us to work full time on music and write the album. But eventually, we were so broke, we all had to get jobs, and which is when I ended up working in the Record and Tape Exchange, which was a kind of refuge for musicians at the time. It was a great.
Yeah, I think it was like the rough trade warehouse, wasn't it? I think a lot of musicians ended in there as well. Yes, you probably cross paths with a lot. But then in the 90s, you get another band together, don't you?
Well, the Palace of Light album got good reviews, but it didn't sell, and we kind of got a bit disillusioned, split up for a bit. Then we reformed, and gradually we kind of morphed into another group called Mabel Joy, which was basically the same. It was me, Jeff, and Matt, but with a different drummer. And Mabel Joy released one album in the early 90s, which again had some strings on it. It was a slightly lighter, more country influence feel, but it was a similar uh, coming from a attempt at a singer-songwriter type thing. And then
Yes.
into that band then. So I think that was 91, maybe that album was released.
I think, well, it says here did 93, so
Okay, yeah.
Wish I Was Here. Wish I Was. And
Yeah.
yeah, God, you would have almost been creeping at that perfect, it's all about, people talk about luck and timing in the music world, and you were kind of there on the outskirts of Britpop, so it's surprising you didn't think, oh, actually, we've got this little moment we could take advantage.
Yeah, it's all a long time ago, but I don't think we just didn't think in those terms. We didn't play live much. We didn't, I think by then we were less engaged with what else was happening, and we were very much caught up in our own world of being interested in Tim Hardin and what have you. And, it was, we never really felt like we fitted into a scene in any way.
No, but you had almost, had not quite 10 years, but sort of quite a long period of time in the music kind of world, doing bands and going into studios and writing material. So it was quite a good shot, really, a good chapter.
Yes, well, and then after Mabel Joy, Matt and I formed another band called Farina that made 2 albums in the late 90s and early noughties, and so we kept going, and we've never stopped really.
Right. My God, you really have gone. That's a lot harder to find anything about your third band, isn't it?
Um, I don't. We recorded 2 albums on Pickled Egg, allotments, and I think they're findable. They're probably on streaming now. They've been long deleted. That.
Yes, God, yes. So have you archived your material? Have you got, MP3s and, have it all sort of nicely sort of saved somewhere for future generations?
Yes, more or less, but I don't think it's as well archived as one would like. But the Palace of Light album was reissued in Spain a while ago. Can't remember how long ago now. And the original master tapes for it were lost. We don't know where they've gone.
Right.
But we had a good enough copy of it to enable a new pressing.
Yes, my God, it's fantastic. That was an extra bonus, actually. I do love the story of bands during that period. And then, so the book, when did you decide you wanted to write or sort of certainly research and get some profile for a rather obscure American singer-songwriter?
Well, I've been interested in him for 40 years. And in fact, when I first moved to London with the Palace of Light, when we were signing on, I I was walking down to the place where we signed on, and I went into a shop and saw the first David Ackles album and liked the look of the cover and bought it on spec. And I've been very interested in him ever since. Got all of his albums quite quickly, and I've written articles about him before and a book chapter. But a couple of years ago, I just thought it's now or never really. I need to try and write a book about him, and fortunately was able to get something together and find a publisher.
With 2-year-old Jawbone, yes, this was quite interesting. I mean, it's kind of interesting because I remember in the 80s always being obsessed with trying to find obscure artists that no one else had found and sort of being excited. People like, I don't know, Randy California from Spirit. And I do remember at the time, Nick Drake getting a compilation of his and people like Donovan and, feeling quite excited because no one else had heard of them. And people like Nick Drake obviously has now become, God, you can buy tea. I think they've got merchandise from Nick Drake now and John Martin. But with this artist, there has not been that kind of traction, really, has there? What's the kind of, how do you sort of explain that?
Well, in many ways, that's what I'm trying to unpick in the book, and I think there are what I concluded at risk of oversimplifying a story is I think some of it is just simple bad luck that you but I think that musically David Ackles was uh, curious, and some of his influences aren't readily understood in the rock world in the very broadest sense, because he was very influenced by music theatre, and that's not something that connects very well with rock music. And so I think people heard that and didn't really know what it was. But also his, he made his albums, and his lost his deal eventually when the albums didn't sell, and then just went off and did other things and had a happy life. And there isn't like a classic rock tragedy narrative there, which so many people who become revered way after they've been active, that there's some kind of intriguing story like that. And David Ackles' story, I think, is intriguing, but it doesn't conform to any of the standard narratives. That he wasn't a tragic figure. He didn't die young. He didn't have a drug habit. He didn't go and live in some cult somewhere, and all of those sorts of things. And I wonder it. I have wondered whether that's a reason why his story hasn't appealed so much. Who knows?
Yes, well, it's kind of interesting. I remember, I don't know, I was listening to the Rocks back pages, I suppose I have to confess, and they would talk about Nick Drake and John Martin, and I don't know, they were slightly, I think, from memory, comparing the two, and this kind of very masculine energy of John Martin and this feminine energy of Nick Drake, which kind of warms to people. People kind of want to somehow mother or understand this kind of tragic loner, which it was an interesting theory. I'm not sure if I completely buy it, but it did make me think, oh, yes, that's quite interesting. It made me think about it anyway. That's the point. And I suppose with David, he doesn't have that slightly lost boy look like Nick Drake. Because I know you sort of mentioned in the book about his rather, but, you mentioned his comfortable lifestyle, but at the same time, there is this kind of sense of this, rather, slightly not weak, but somebody who you feel like now, decades later, just was misunderstood and needed to be somehow sort of given a big hug somehow.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't come across as a lost boy at all, because he was actually older. He didn't start his recording career until he was in his 30s, and in those days that was very, very unusual. So he didn't have that fragile, vulnerable thing. I think that which you mentioned that Nick Drake had, and in fact Bernie Taupin, who produced his third album, and knew David quite well, talks about him being like a kind of, robust, hearty kind of outdoors man. He's almost like a pioneering figure, is how Bernie Taupin describes him. So again, I think that isn't a type of character that he finds a niche easily in the music business.
Yes, it's interesting because I was looking at his age, actually, realizing he was born 1937, wasn't it? So he sort of by 1967, the Summer of Love, he was 30, and he probably did sort of look rather out of time. And also at times, I don't know if it was true to myself, but there was a sort of element of Anthony Newley listening to some of his music, and as you mentioned, there was that musical theatre bit to his kind of world, which is almost like. Yes, you wonder how you kind of put somebody in some sort of category, and it was probably he didn't fit anywhere, did he?
He didn't, and at the time when his records were reviewed, you can tell that people didn't really know how to describe him. He'd quite often be described as a folk artist, which he quite palpably isn't, and even sometimes a jazz artist, which he isn't, and that extended to his playing live, because there weren't many venues where he fitted easily, because if he was on a rock bill, he just played live piano solo. That didn't work. And but he was quite often in folk clubs as well, and that wasn't quite right either, and the pianos were always out of tune and that sort of thing. So he wasn't easy to place in a niche at the time, and that's why a big reason why it was hard to market him. But he got very good reviews, and he was admired at the time, particularly in Britain, less so in America. But he was admired, and on his first album, quite a lot of his songs were covered by interesting British acts. The Hollies, Spooky Tooth, Martin Carthy, quite a few cover versions.
And that was released, that was 1968, wasn't it, that he brought that out, which must have been, yes, it must have been quite a strange one. I sort of often realise at the time when you think back of it, what was going on post Summer of Love, everyone's still getting excited about the Beatles and the Stones and psychedelia, and I'm being obsessed with David Bowie. I remember sort of thinking, I can't imagine what people could have thought when he brought out some of those albums in the mid to late 60s, just going, I'm not quite sure. This is just not anything, David. This is just not going to... David Bowie, this is not... But, the same with the other David, because, at the time, there was a lot of other things to listen to.
Yeah, I think 1968, 1969, when David Ackles was first releasing music, that was a funny time, because as you say, there was still the psychedelic thing going on, but a lot of music was becoming much heavier at that point. That was just the beginnings of heavy rock, really. And at the same time, there was a lot of folky stuff still, and country rock. So it was a period when music was going in all sorts of different directions, I think.
Yes, and the early years of Laurel Canyon, which obviously, yes, it was quite interesting. So his third album, this is his classic one, isn't it? American Gothic. So what was the background to this? Because again, this is the one that's produced by Bernie, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, American Gothic was recorded in England. David had become friends with Bernie Taupin when David Ackles supported Elton John, when Elton John did his first gigs in America at the Troubadour Club in 1970. Bernie and David became friends, and David Ackles, it somehow came about that Bernie would produce the album, and David Ackles moved to a small town village called Walgrave in Berkshire in 1971. It's kind of west of London. And he lived there for nearly a year and prepared the album. And when it was time to record it in March 72, he recorded it in London over 2 weeks at IBC Studios, which was a famous studio at the time. The Who and the Kinks and Hendrix had recorded there. And the album was he had more control over it than his previous albums in that he arranged it, as well as writing all the songs and singing. Obviously, he arranged the album. Um, and it got fantastic reviews when it came out, like really reviews that seem almost kind of comically exaggerated now, and people uh, wondering whether it was the best album ever made or the second best album ever made, and heralding a whole new direction in music and what have you. But that, in a way, worked against him because as hype often does, it was because after a while people started to say, well, I've heard this record and it's good, but it's not quite as good as what the reviewers are saying, is it? And so you
Right.
had this sort of strange dynamic that played out over just a few months, really, where the album was released on July the 4th, 1972, and for a month or so before that and 2 months after, he was the coming thing. But towards the end of the year, even in 1972, the end of 1972, there were Whatever Happened to David Ackles articles appearing.
Right.
So that, because of course in those days there wasn't like the instant availability of everything. So if a record wasn't a hit, it disappeared, and he wasn't on the radio. And he was completely forgotten, and that all played out in less than a year.
Yes. And it was also, I suppose at that time, we'd started having Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, possibly Carole King. So there'd been a lot of good singer-songwriters appearing who fitted into a certain scene, didn't they, so to speak?
Yes, and you mentioned the Laurel Canyon thing. It's interesting because David Ackles, he didn't live in Laurel Canyon, but he wasn't far off, and he would play at the Troubadour. But he was, in terms of, I mean, apart from being 10 years older than everyone else, he musically he was different from that scene. Obviously different, and didn't quite fit with it at all. And that definitely worked against him.
Yes. So how did he then sort of navigate the tricky Five and Dime album after that kind of experience? Because is he still on his label at this stage?
Well, the first three albums are on Elektra, and apparently by the terms of his contract, he could have held out to do another album, but he and Jack Holtzman, who ran Elektra, came to the mutual agreement that it wasn't working and that David should move on. And so he signed to Columbia, and the person who ran Columbia then, Clive Davis,
Oh,
big
yes.
music business, who's still alive and still working. And Clive was a fan of David's and signed him to a small deal. But shortly after signing David, Clive Davis was sacked from Columbia over some scandal that turned out to be completely unfounded. But he was out of the picture. And at the same time, David Ackles, just by unfortunate coincidence, lost his management. And so he was a bit high and dry. But there wasn't much money in the deal, and so he decided to largely make the record at home. And he got,
Oh, yes, on his 4-track. I remember that, yes.
and he recorded the record largely in his living room at home. He just got married and he lived in Pacific Palisades, and made most of the record there. And then when most of it was recorded, they took it into a bigger studio and bounced the tracks onto a 16-track to add some orchestrations and what have you. But it was largely a home recording, which was quite unusual at the time. But by the time the album was released, Clive Davis was gone, and David Ackles didn't have any management. He didn't know a soul at Columbia, literally didn't know anyone. And the record hardly got any promotion and wasn't released in Britain, which was where his main audience was. And so it sank without trace, really. Got a few reviews and was very quickly forgotten. It didn't sell.
But he would have been perfect for the old grey whistle test. I would imagine Whispering Bob. Just, I mean,
It was on the
people.
Old Grey Whistle test. He played in the first series, I think, of the Whistle Test, January 72, but unfortunately it's lost, as these things often are. It was before Bob Harris, it was Richard Williams.
Right. Oh, God. I've seen some amazing clips of people like Keith Christmas being
Yes.
interviewed, everyone with a fag, and then him doing some acoustic, a cappella number in the chair. It was it's of its time, isn't it? If you remember, if you've seen that clip, it's just beautiful and yes, very pre-punk.
Yes.
It's really nice. Yes, I could imagine the British audience actually really loving the quirkiness of his songwriting and his vocals because it again, it is very mannered and very staged, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, he came from a stage background. His mother was English, and she emigrated to America as a child. But her family, her parents and grandparents, were music hall entertainers. They were like song and dance act and comedians and what have you. And that heritage came through very strongly to David Ackles, and he loved the stage and loved stage music.
Yes, interesting, isn't it? So after those albums, his 4 albums, how does he then navigate the rest of his 70s and life?
Well, the guy who he worked with to produce Five and Dime, somebody called Douglas Graham, was a script writer by trade, and David Ackles teamed up with him, and they did some TV work, and they scripted one made for TV film that was released. Uh, and he did that for a bit. He did some teaching. I think he did some charity fundraising. So he just worked, just got jobs and earned money. But he was always composing. Immediately after losing his record deal, he still had a publishing deal and would write songs and submit them for other artists to record, but they were never recorded. But before long, he started to pursue his ambition to write a stage musical. And really, from the mid 70s until he died in 1999, his creative energies went into that. There are a couple of projects that he pursued for quite a long time and, wrote whole musicals with scripts, 25, 30 songs to them, but they never got full productions. And he sadly died before he could realize that ambition.
Yes, because he did a screenplay, didn't he, with a Word of Honor, which
Yeah.
was features one of my, I wouldn't say favourite actors, but somebody who I had a great fondness of was Carl with a K, Malden, wasn't it? Who was in the film Cincinnati Kid, with Steve McQueen, which I just thought was the most brilliant film ever.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, Word of Honor was. It's a pretty good TV film, really. You can find it on YouTube. It's out there. I think it was released in, was it 80 or 81? I think. And there's a very young John Malkovich in it, actually. I think it was his first ever appearance.
Right, there you go. But then in 81, he has the car crash, which just sounds absolutely life-changing.
Yes, he had a serious car accident where he was hit by an uninsured driver who was under the influence, and yeah, I think he nearly lost his life. He was in hospital for quite a long time. He had to use a wheelchair for some time afterwards. He hip replacements, nearly lost his arm. Um, there's there's a kind of anecdote which is true apparently of his wife turning up at the hospital and saying don't amputate his arm because he's a piano player, and they didn't amputate his arm, but uh, it's thought that he probably had discomfort for the rest of his life. He did recover and went back to work and was active again, but it was a serious accident.
Yes, God, and then he dies of lung cancer in 1999. So putting this book together then, because you've used lots of script from sort of interviews that you've collected, and then you've written your own piece. So did that process take a long time to manage to put together?
It took probably about 2 to 2.5 years, but I had a fair amount of the material before I started. So I'd interviewed David and exchanged emails with him when he was alive at the end of his life. And I'd spoken with his wife many times in the intervening years. And I had some archive interviews, but I started to work seriously on the book about 2.5 years ago. And managed to amass quite a lot of material then and track down some people who played on his records or produced them or childhood friends, what have you.
God, that must have been good fun to do that.
It was really interesting. And something that was really nice about it is that nobody had a bad word to say about him. Everybody said, as well as being really talented, he was a really good guy, and people really spoke warmly of him, which was nice to hear.
Yes, my God. And like my musical hero from the 80s, the Smiths, the lead singer. And that was, God knows what they'll say. But yes, because I was because I mean, being the 80s indie kid, John Peel was everything to me. And I sort of listened to him sort of religiously with my TDK D90 cassette. So he was also a fan of David as well, wasn't he?
Absolutely. Yeah. When David Ackles, when his first album was just about to be released, he came to the UK and was here for probably about 6 weeks or 2 months, doing a few gigs and on TV. But he did a John Peel session then, and John Peel was a fan and played him quite a bit at the time, and continued to play him when subsequent albums were released. And then when David died, actually, I believe that night John Peel played a song in his honour.
Yes, Sonny Come Home.
That's it. That's the one. Yeah.
That's one. And then Phil Collins on Desert Island Discs and Elvis Costello. So there's a lot of interest with obviously serious musicians.
Yes, I mean he was admired by his peers, particularly British musicians, and uh, not so much American musicians, which is difficult to understand. But yes, he was very admired, and of course, particularly Elton John and Bernie Taupin uh, thought he was, really looked up to him, and will still speak very, very positively about his influence.
With the interviews in the book with Bernie, are they ones done at the time, or are they ones that you've done recently?
No, I was in touch with Bernie over the past year or so.
Right, that must be. I guess people like that must be really pleased to know that yourself are sort of trying to sort of highlight this guy's career.
Well, I hope so. I hope so. I mean, Bernie was extremely helpful, and I hope he's pleased with what I've done. I mean, it's interesting talking with not just Bernie, but other musicians and producers and what have you that were involved with making those records, because it's so long ago, and it, not much detail survives in memory, really. And why should it? I mean, the American Gothic was recorded in 2 weeks flat, and it's so in lots of ways, if you imagine somebody coming to you and asking you what you were doing 50 years ago for 2 weeks, even if it was something that seemed quite significant at the time, you're not going to remember a lot of detail. So it was great to talk to musicians who played on the records, but something I'm really conscious of, and I'm say this in the book, that it isn't a comprehensive life of David Ackles. There are gaps in it, and there are things that I'll never know and maybe are lost forever.
Yes, I know. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I spoke to a few musicians who were, did those sessions, and sometimes like Chris Spedding, and I said, "My God, you've been on all these records. Did you know it was going to be here?" And he said, I can't even remember being on it. I went into the studio, did the, I don't know, I can't live if living is without you, and just laid down what I had to do and went home again. It wasn't a big thing at the time. You think, oh, yeah, it was to me when I was growing up. I thought it was amazing. So,
That's right. I mean, there's a guy called Doug Hastings who played on the first David Ackles record, guitarist, and he played in the second one as well. And I've seen he's credited on the album, and I've seen session records where he's listed as the session leader. And when I spoke to him, he didn't even know that he was on the record and has got no recollection of it at all. But of course, you're talking about a 3 hour session, maybe 3 3 hour sessions in August 1969 or something. Why should he remember that when he might have been doing 2 or 3 sessions a day?
yes, I know. We forget that that's what they were doing. So it's just a blur, isn't it, really? And what did you discover during the book that you hadn't thought or didn't realise when you started?
Oh, so many things. I found out a lot more detail about the work that David was doing after his recording career stopped, when he was trying to write musicals. I found out a lot more about his earlier life. He was involved. He was an actor, which I knew, but I hadn't realised the extent of it. He was in a string of Hollywood B movies as a child, and was very keen at one stage of trying to break into Broadway as an actor, and indeed went, that was something he aimed at. He had a year in Edinburgh at university, when he was at university in the 1950s, which is a strange thought. But I think the things that about the records that most struck me is that most of them he had unsuccessful attempts to record them with really good musicians and producers and arrangers, really top names, but it just didn't work out, and he wasn't happy with it, and he went and did them again. And that shows a kind of single-mindedness and seriousness of artistic purpose. He really knew what he wanted, and even though he's playing with these great like Wrecking Crew musicians, people who played up with the Beach Boys and everything, he wasn't happy with it, and he wanted to do it again, and I was impressed by that.
And that is the end of the interview. A massive thank you to Mark Brend. Give me the time for that interview to find out more about his life in music, and also the new book that's just come out, Down a River in Search of David Ackles, available from all good bookshops and also online. Do check it out. That's on Jawbone Press. This has been the C86 show. David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on any of the social media platform sites. And also, all these interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. Aren't you lucky? Have a great week. Stay safe.